All right, mic's on. Yep, thanks Noah for the introduction. Like Noah says, currently I'm the Chief UX Architect at ClearStory Data. Prior, I was at Google for a little over 6 years, where I was the lead designer for Google Analytics and Google AdWords. I came to Google via an acquisition called MeasureMap, which was a startup I was a part of, and I have a Master's of Communication Design from the Institute of Design. When I came out of Google, I was sort of indirectly involved in the big data market, working on Google AdWords and Google Analytics. And it was always an interesting topic to me. But when I got out of Google and joined ClearStory, this was sort of the first impression I had when I was looking around the big data market. A 2000-ish cell phone, really great technology, lots of promise. People knew that this technology was going to change the world. But it was a little clunky. Like there was still some fog between this and what we knew could happen. I also noticed that organizations hired people like this. How many people know who this is? All right, a few people. We're kind of cutting out on lunch, right? So this is Jonah Hill, but he's playing a character called, he's playing somebody named Paul DePodesta, right? He was hired by the Oakland Athletics. Tell a little bit of the story. I'm sure a lot of Bay Area people know the story, but the Oakland Athletics are famous for having a really low payroll compared to other Major League Baseball teams. And they were struggling to compete, so they hired a guy like this who was bringing in a new way of thinking how to evaluate talent. So Paul, what he did is he'd used math, algorithms, and data. So he was really a data scientist where he could use all this information and uncover undervalued players that other organizations were ignoring for various reasons. And so a lot of organizations seem to think that this is one way to solve the big data problem. The issue with this is that a recent survey found about 65% of organizations expect their demand will outpace supply. So this is really not a scalable solution if we want big data products to live and thrive in organizations. So the question is, how do we move from very promising technology that we know has the potential to change the world to something like this, where it's cutting-edge technology that's wrapped up in a really elegant and designed, and everyone in this room, I'm sure, has one of these things, so it's everywhere. So how do we move from old clunky technology to something like this? Or how do we move away from this being a solution where one or few people within an organization have access to meaningful data to empowering an entire team or entire organization, from executives to managers to line of business users? So this is exactly what our vision is at ClearStory Data. We want to enable organizations to adopt a data-driven culture. And we're doing this in two different ways. We're investing in great technology. We're also investing in the user experience of our product. And so today I'm going to talk about 4 principles we're using at ClearStory Data to help achieve this goal. So the first principle I call embrace empathy. So this guy right here, he's about to experience what I'm assuming is something that he generally doesn't. I don't know for sure, but I'm imagining this guy doesn't walk around in red high heels a lot. Right? So he's going to slip these on, and he's going to feel what it's like to walk in these. He's probably going to turn an ankle. He's going to trip over cracks in the ground. He's going to literally feel what it's like to walk in these shoes. And I think this image embraces what I feel is important for big data products and organizations to do to really get in the mindset of how their users are using big data. So empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. So let's look at an example. So anybody recognize this? Have this in their home? Right? I know we had this. I imagine 15, 20, 30 years ago, this was probably in most people's homes in the United States. This is the Honeywell thermostat. So this was a device that let people obviously heat and cool their home. Very easy to use, and it worked. Well, fast forward a few years, and you have a device like this. So anybody have a device like this in their house? Yeah. To me, this sort of epitomizes technology guiding the design of a product. So I'm going to resist the temptation to talk too much about it, but I have to mention it. If you just look at the interface of this product, it's such a mess, right? Like, where do you click? Or where do you touch the thing? Like, what are you supposed to be looking at? Everything's sort of at the same visual level. If you look at the bottom buttons there, if you could see it, sort of the hierarchy, the information architecture of this product, the buttons say things like, schedule, hold, clock, screen, more. Like, what does that mean? How do you expect users to really embrace the technology? There's all sorts of other things I could comment on the surface of this. But I think sort of the most devastating part of this product is this actually has technology that could help homeowners and people who are using this product save a lot of money. And if you imagine if most homes in America fully utilized all the technical abilities of this product, it could address significant problems, right? It could really decrease the amount of energy needed to heat homes. But I have to venture, most people who use this product probably have it on hold, or it might be programmed just because the person who installed this showed them how to program it. If we contrast that with a product like this, so this is Nest. How many people know about this product? Yeah, so a lot of people. How many actually have one? I'm going to pick on a few people. So when you have people over, I mean, do you purposely show them this device? Yeah, so I mean, whoever thought a year or two ago that a home thermostat unit would be something you're proud to show people? So, you know, Nest, if you don't know what it is, it's a self-learning device. So you could use it in multiple different ways, but one way you do it, you can just install it, and it's wrapped in really great technology that learns when you're coming and going, and it self-adjusts the temperature of your house based on that. It also has an interface, a really nice interface that allows you to manually control that, both on the unit itself and on a handheld device. You know, a guy named, a former Apple employee, Tony Fadell, actually leads this group up. So he comes from a company, Apple, that sort of embraces this. But contrary to what some people think, Tony and his team didn't go somewhere for a few months in Palo Alto or some design center, sort of you know, think about this idea and suddenly emerge with this in the market, put it in a box and sell it. In fact, I know Google Ventures invested in this company, and some of my former friends and colleagues actually worked really closely with the Nest team. They did a significant amount of testing of this, and they brought this into people's homes, and they observed how they used this technology and how they really wanted to interact with the device. So really, Nest wasn't born out of just a brilliant designer's mind. It was born out of really embracing empathy of people. And I think, though, the problem is in big data, I think a lot of customers think that this is what big data is. Anybody know what this is? See how technical an audience it is. It's a MapReduce job, right? I had to ask some engineers at ClearStory Data for you know, a screenshot of this. This is MapReduce. It's very technical, and I think this represents what a lot of customers in this world or organizations who want to utilize big data think big data is. It's very technical. It's generally hard to use. They know they should use it, so you know, they want to, and they might hire an expert to try to do it, but there's sort of a disconnect between what customers think the solutions are and what we're providing them. So the question is, how do we build the nest of big data? So one principle is embracing empathy, and I think there's 3 ingredients here. So one is actively listening to customers. So at ClearStory, when we talk to our customers, we don't only ask them, you know, can you find certain buttons, can you use certain functionality, can you get through an interaction that's important. We also ask questions like, who needs access to this data? Or when are you going to consume the data? You know, where are there silos in an organization where if data was there, they can make better decisions? So we're asking questions beyond sort of the simple interface questions, which are very important to ask and make sure those are right. We're asking sort of macro questions because we're trying to get a sense of empathy or understanding of what they're going through. We also eat our own dog food, even when it's hard. Now, a lot of us in this room work on big data products or in the enterprise world. This is sort of hard for us. So at Google, I had a lot of my friends and colleagues who worked on things like Gmail or Google+. For them, it was easy to use their own product because it was part of their everyday workflow. But for us who are in sort of more enterprise products, this is harder because sometimes we have to spin up some clusters, get a lot of data. It costs the company money to actually run dog food, perhaps more than what some of our colleagues have. So this is hard, but it's still really important. One thing I did when I was the lead designer on AdWords was, again, sort of that shared similar characteristics is that the designers on the AdWords team weren't advertisers, so they weren't really naturally using AdWords. I incentivized my team by setting up contests and stuff for them to run campaigns, and the people who ran the most successful campaigns, there was a little incentive afterwards. So you got to find ways, especially in the enterprise world, to get people who are designing and making a product to really eat your own dog food. Now, when you eat your own dog food, you also want to evaluate your product through the lens of your customer. And what I mean by this is, again, you're not simply using your product to make sure this thing works, this interaction's smooth, the data's loading. That's all very important, and you ought to do that. But you also should do things like what we're trying to do what we're doing at ClearStory Data, which is we're loading real data into our product. And we're using the same data sets that our customers are using, and we're trying to uncover the same types of insights they are. we're using it in a similar circumstance. So if we're doing sort of live situational analysis, we'll try to simulate that as, to really feel the pain or feel what we're bringing to the customer, so we can understand where the challenges are in that process. Principle number 2, everyone is a designer. So I have found that this is sort of one typical way people look at how a designer should work. Right? They're sort of off alone, sort of in sort of crazy clothes, kind of a funky t-shirt or shirt. They're off in a basement somewhere being really creative. So I find this mindset exists in both in young designers and in organizations who are new to design. They think that this is how a designer ought to work. And I call this the lone designer myth, which states that the designer's job is to mysteriously come up with a design without any help across the organization. Another way to demonstrate this is, when you hire a Rockstar Designer, this is how you think they should be, right? Sort of like Jimi Hendrix on a stage, jamming out all by themselves, sort of melting your face off, right? Doing great things without any help from anyone else. But really, in the big data market, it's important that your designers and the design process looks more like this, where a designer is more of an orchestrator, right? He's a conductor. He's helping teams think through problems. So he's in the same way a conductor is really controlling the rhythm and the sound and knowing when to bring some instruments in and when to fade them out. Same way a designer has to do similar things within an organization. So people ask me then, if this is how a designer ought to work, so what's the role of designer in a collaborative environment? I think there's 2 things. So like I mentioned, they need to orchestrate this process. So this is so important that a lot of, in fact, most design schools that I know of teach this exact skill to designers. The collaborative process, when it works well, it's great. But I'm sure a lot of people have been part of a collaborative process that really falls apart. So designers aren't really just supposed to go sit somewhere and come up with something creative. They have to really orchestrate this process. So what that means is a designer has to get to know people across the organization because they need to know who to invite to meetings when. They also know how to effectively run a collaborative process. So that means getting all the right things together. It could be sticky notes. It could be making sure there's a whiteboard around. And also during that meeting, it means that this designer needs to understand when voices should be heard, like when an engineer should speak up, or when a product manager could speak up, or when a different perspective could exist, right? So maybe a product manager recognizes something happening within the marketplace. The designer needs to sort of tease all these things out. And during this process, the designer needs to know at what stage is this feature. So is this a brand new feature we're inventing from scratch? Well, the conversation then needs to be about sort of volume of ideas. If it's a feature that people realize that's really not working, volume isn't as important, it's the details, right? And working with the engineers and figuring out those details. So it's really being a very instrumental part of this collaborative process. The second part, though, is the more traditional design skills. So after the collaborative process, you take the best parts of these ideas that were discussed. So you take all the sticky notes, you take all the ideas that were discussed. And the designer's job then is to put those things together in an expert way. So this is when the designer typically uses their formal design skills, right? All the stuff we typically think a designer does, color, space, typography. They make a really compelling experience. The third design principle, always improving, never perfect. So there's a notion out there that a designer's job is to make something perfect. And oftentimes this leaks into a product. Like you want to make the perfect solution right away. But in my experience, I have found that one of the most paralyzing attitudes a designer or a team could have is to strive for the perfect solution at the wrong time. I'm going to tell you a little story. So anybody? Well, this is Google AdWords. Does anybody here use Google AdWords? OK, so we got a fair number of people. So roughly 2 years prior to me joining AdWords, it went through a significant redesign. 2 years later, I joined the team, and the product looked like this. There's nothing significantly wrong with it. It looked OK. It was a little out of date. A lot of the buttons in different sections were inconsistent. A lot of features and functionality were added that were sort of breaking the initial intent of the design. And there were a few other things that were wrong. And people on the AdWords team knew this. It wasn't a big secret. The problem was that AdWords is such a big product. If you know anything about Google, AdWords is a very important and strategic part of what Google does. It was a big ship to turn around. So there were multiple efforts, both on the design side and the product side and engineering side, to address some of these problems. The issue was they were focusing too much on the perfect solution, right? They wanted to like bite off everything at once and create a perfect redesigned AdWords. The problem was if you sort of went through the steps to try to do that, the effort was just too great and all those projects typically failed. So after I joined AdWords, I asked the team, let's focus on something, right? Obviously trying to do everything at once isn't working, so let's focus on something. We talked about focusing on the information architecture, which is like how the product is organized. We talked about maybe different key interactions that we could address. We talked about the visual layer, and actually that's where we started. He said, the easiest thing we can do is pitch the idea where we would just touch the CSS. So if you don't know what CSS, it's basically the technology that creates the layout and the button styles and all that stuff. And so we sold that project. We sold it in a couple different ways. One is we were going to address specific customer complaints that we're hearing, which was the vertical space of the product. So we were going to adjust that. But we also said, we're just going to bring a level we're going to refresh the visual level of our product. We're going to show some progress that we're making on here. And we did that. And we spent several months, a fairly large team. This is a big product. So even though the description might sound not that big of a project, it actually was really big. There's lots of different binaries that ran this application. So it was harder than what you might first think. And this is what we came up with. So if I flip between these two things, so this is the old one. This is the visual refresh, right? So the difference isn't significant for us in this crowd. But I can tell you, people who use AdWords are in this multiple hours every single day. And they noticed this change, and they appreciated this change. You can see we actually addressed some issues people had. So it's a little tighter. We also refreshed. It looked a little more modern, right? We brought consistency to buttons. So we solved real problems. We just didn't try to bite off too much. The result of this, two things happened. One is that there was sort of this negative, after so many people within the AdWords team sort of were banging their heads against the wall because they couldn't make any progress on this problem, this sort of like got people unstuck. It sort of made people think about, different ways that they could tackle this problem. It also did another thing in the customers. Prior to this, most reactions we got from customers when we launched something new on AdWords was negative. And the reason is because if you disrupt a workflow for anybody who uses a product multiple hours a day, you're going to really tick them off, right? So you have to make sure those changes that you do are well worth it. And the good thing about this is because it was so subtle, and it was sort of like the first sort of change they saw that really made a difference in people's lives, even if it was a small difference, customers started appreciating this. So I think this sort of paved the way of trust between us, or the Google AdWords team, and the end users of this product. So what's the advantages of striving for better, especially in a big data market like this? So one is quick iterations, you can make progress. Again, this environment here, a lot of talks here are talking about new technology that could bring new ways in which we could bring data to folks, right? So quickly iterating, not focusing on the perfect problem. If you do that, the tendency is to spend too much time on this one problem. And in the big data market, there's probably going to be technology that could change the way you do that. So when you focus on making things better rather than the perfect solution, you could iterate really quickly and you can make progress on things, which is important. The other thing this allows you to do is get continual feedback and ideas. And this is critical as well. So again, as we learn new ways organizations want to utilize data, as we learn about different parts of the organization that are missing data and would love to have it, this allows you to get feedback on the ideas you're creating to address those problems. Finally, you don't over-engineer ideas. So this is a huge mistake I see both designers and engineers and product managers do all the time, which is they have technology, it could do a million different things, and they over-engineer the heck out of an idea. And the end result usually is, one, it takes a really long time to actually get something out there, and two, it's generally harder to use because you're addressing so many different possible use cases that people have a hard time understanding exactly what it's supposed to do. So if you focus on making things better rather than perfect, you generally can avoid this temptation. Finally, the fourth design principle, make beauty a priority. Does anybody recognize this? So this is a Braun razor. So When this came out in about the 1950s, this was cutting edge technology when it came to shaving. Right? Most shavers prior to this were the old sort of razor blade shaves. Right? So Braun introduced new technology, had like 2 rotating heads and all the fancy bells and whistles that were involved in this product. But they also hired somebody named Dieter Rams. And how many people have heard of Dieter Rams in this room? Right? Okay, so designers, some people have. I think if you look at this product, it doesn't take too keen of a design eye, to recognize that the work he did in 1950 continues to influence products we use today. So Braun recognized the fact that, yeah, we could have really great technology, but if we don't embrace beauty and make something that people want, you're not going to have mass adoption of a product. In fact, Rams is famous in saying, the aesthetic quality of a product is integral to its usefulness, because products we use every day affect our person and our well-being. Another way I would say this is that if we want people to use big data products every day, if we want organizations to adopt data into their culture, we need to have a level of beauty in our product, or at least a level where people want to use your product. So if you look a little deeper, so this is what a typical personal radio looked like in 1950. It's not terrible, but it uses a lot of different surfaces, a lot of different colors, it highlights different elements. A lot of things are happening on this device. And this is what Rams introduced to the market in 1950. So this is a radio. Again, I think if you look at this, you could recognize that sort of why Rams is considered one of the most iconic designers that ever lived. I mean, in 1950, he was introducing devices that look like this. Again, I don't think it takes too much of a keen eye to see how long-standing his designs were in terms of impacting consumer goods beyond 1950. In fact, Rams was famously quoted in saying, when he was asked, what do you think of Jonathan Ives' work, and what Apple's doing? Rams says, I like what Jonathan's doing. In fact, I think it's a compliment. Right? So he recognized the fact that people today, contemporaries who are designing devices that we have in our pockets right now, is taking cues from a guy in 1950. So Rams really embraced this. So if you looked in the mid-2000s, so 2004, 2005, this is a typical web analytics application. So this is Urchin. Right, here's another one, Stat Counter. Right? Both of these products really, in my opinion, underinvested in beauty. Right? They were also sort of expensive and hard to use. Here's another typical solution we found in about 2004 and 2005, which is literally taking log files from your server and jamming them into Excel and putting some graphs on it. Right? So the folks at AdaptivePath, which is a user experience design consulting in San Francisco that I worked for, recognized this. In fact, they were doing a lot of work with bloggers and companies who were providing the blogging platform for these folks. And they quickly realized that bloggers didn't want to use these tools for several different reasons, including they were expensive, they were hard to use, it was sort of like overkill, and the aesthetic quality really wasn't what they were looking for. So I was part of the team that created this. So this is MeasureMap. So this was probably 2005. So you could contrast the difference between what was available in the market and what we produced. So MeasureMap used very cutting-edge front-end technology. So we integrated Flash and HTML. And back in 2005, if you remember, that was sort of like where the cutting edge of front-end technology was. We also really understood what bloggers wanted to get out of a web analytics package. Right? They didn't need all the features and functionality that existed in Urchin, plus they couldn't afford it. They really wanted to know who was visiting their blog, who was linking to their blog, what comments were being left on their blog and where those were being left, and who were reading their posts. Right? So we made a product that was beautifully designed for these people. And so what are the different parts of beauty? Right? So I think one part's the visual layer. And this is probably the most standard way in which people think beauty exists. So in big data products, it could be the typography, the color, the size, the visualizations. All these are very important things to invest in when you're trying to make a beautiful product. But there's also parts like the interaction layer or the application flows that facilitate user tasks. Right? If you invest in these things and you make these beautifully efficient, you make these work really, really well, that's another way you can invest in beauty. Or the information architecture layer, or how the product is organized. So in MeasureMap, we got rid of the very long list of things on the left-hand side, a long list of different reports you can get, and we boiled it down to exactly what we knew our audience wanted. right? So beauty could live at the information architecture layer as well. And finally, at the application layer, or sort of the overall experience of the product. One thing I do is, if you're using an application, an online product, and you notice maybe one or two of those sections are designed really well, like it might have really great visualizations, or one home screen looks really good, but then you sort of move away from that path and you get into different parts of the application and the design quickly falls apart. To me, that's at least one indication that the people who are making that product aren't really investing in sort of the application level beauty of their product. And so all these parts, the visual layer, the interaction layer, the information architecture, and the entire sort of way the product is put together is very important when you're trying to make beauty a priority. Let me tell you one last story here. So this is Google Analytics. How many people in this room use Google Analytics? So a lot. So this is what we launched in May of 2007. So this is a little bit of history. So Google bought Urchin, which was one of the products we showed. Great technology. A year later, they acquired MeasureMap. The first day we got to Google, after they showed us where the free food was and where the massage therapists were, they said, great job on MeasureMap. Now help us redesign Google Analytics. And so what we did, we first sort of embraced empathy. We went to users, we went to people who we know we want to use Google Analytics. This is before we even had any interface. We didn't have any product. And we talked to these customers. We asked them, how do you measure success when you're looking at your website? Who uses web analytics to make decisions every day? Where in the organization does web analytics work? Or where doesn't it work? And so we really wanted to get in the mindset of how people were using web analytics. We also, we knew that although we were acquired for our design talent, we knew that we couldn't design this all by ourselves. So we didn't go somewhere in Google, sort of sequestered ourselves in a corner somewhere. We actively engaged everybody involved in the analytics product. Right? That included sales, that included engineering, that included product managers. And every day we were meeting with these folks, and we were understanding technology because at the same time they were rewriting technology, we were rewriting the user interface or design of the product. So we influenced design as much as we influenced engineering because we showed them what we want to do with design, and they influenced what we could do with the design because we had a really firm understanding of where the technology was going. And the product managers help us understand where the market was going to go, like what features and functionalities did these customers need. And the sales and support, we learned from them, like how do you sell a product like this? What are people looking for when they're looking for an analytics solution? We also left room for beauty, right? We knew that if we wanted people to use analytics in the way that Google wanted people to use it, which is basically mass adoption, we knew this product had to have a certain level of aesthetic beauty. And so we left room for that. So what that meant was that it took a little more time to do things. We wanted to make sure things were aligned in a way that perhaps other products weren't. We invested in the visual layer, right? This is sort of a rich dashboard. We spent a lot of time figuring out left-hand navigation. You can see this is a lot smaller than some of the other products, right? So we have visitors, traffic sources, content, and goals, like boiled down to what we felt was the most important parts of the application. So we sort of let beauty exist in this product. And the result of this is the most recent public survey I found, is today Google Analytics is used by about 50% of all websites, which is about an 80% market share. So the point there is when you wrap a really great experience around cutting edge technology like Google Analytics, you could disrupt a market in significant ways. So the view we have at ClearStory Data is that once you balance this equation, when you invest equally in design and in technology, and you embrace some of these design principles like empathy, and you embrace sort of a team collaborative environment where everyone is a designer within an organization, and you focus on improving things rather than the perfect solution, and then you make beauty a priority, that's when we'll have products that enable organizations to adopt a data-driven culture. Thank you. I think Noah and I might have a small conversation if you do have questions. I also have office hours right after this, so it's in Exhibit Hall, Table A, if you want to continue this conversation.
Thanks for paying attention here. So I do have a couple of questions. And I'm unfortunately going to have to lean forward to speak into the mic rather than looking at Doug while I ask him questions. I'm thrilled you brought up Dieter Rams because he's had such a huge influence. One thing that I was wondering is if you were going to put any of his design principles up on screen, and if you want to mention those briefly, or I can mention those briefly.
Yeah, well, so yeah, if you Google Dieter Rams, probably one of the first search results you'll see is he actually published, it's a poster, it's these 10 principles of great design. And the aesthetic principle I talked about was one of the 10. You know, he talks about how, I mean, he had a very specific way to view design, which is great. I recommend you should all go look at it. Some of the ones I remember off the top of my head, you know, or he's famous. If you looked at his product, you could tell he's sort of embraces less is more, right? So that was a big thing. If you contrast the 1950s Zenith personal radio with what he introduced to the market, he basically eliminated all unnecessary elements and only boiled it down to sort of its essence. And so if you look at all the products that Rams designed for Braun, he really embraces that empathy, or that point of view. You know, good design is innovative, I think, is another one he says, right? So good design, how I interpret that, especially in the big data market, is that, you know, design coupled with great technology is one way to bring a market a great product.
And one other thing that I took away from my reading of Rams is that he talks about beauty, but he very clearly spells out that functionality matters, efficiency matters. It's not just aesthetics. And that there's, if you look at beauty as an aesthetic-only depth, it's very thin. You don't actually get a beautiful product. You get a product that's been made pretty on the surface, but it doesn't have that depth of functionality. And I think that's a fascinating insight, given that he was dealing with razors and radios and physical things that didn't, you know, the radio in 1950 was not a particularly sophisticated interface, and now we're dealing with arbitrarily complex interfaces. And I think the things that he was aware of, the things that he was talking about decades ago are probably more applicable now than they were then.
Well, so that was the point.
Interestingly enough,
you know, the one point is, you know, beauty doesn't only exist at the visual level. It could have an interaction level, sort of how your product is organized, and sort of the holistic view of your product.
One last question, and take as long as you want with this. What's next in terms of good aesthetics and good functionality and good design when it comes to big data, when it comes to visualization, when it comes to access and getting knowledge out of the big data?
Yeah. So, you know, what I found is, appropriately so, a lot of companies focus on the visualization, and I think that's fine, and we should continue to do that. We should make great visualizations that deal with big data. But I think there's also so many other parts of the big data problem that need really solid design thinking. You know, it sort of ranges from how do you get data out of sort of all the silos that exist into a product. Like, that's not, in my mind, not only a technical problem, that's also could be a design problem, right? How do you effectively get data from an application out to an organization? Right? That's a huge problem. So how do you empower all these people? You know, how do you look at data in different contexts? Like, is it live situational analysis, or is it sort of after an event? Sort of all these things, I think, aren't only just about visualizations, right? It's the holistic sort of dealing with the big data problem from sort of this perspective.